Okay, this is a video on the poem Rooms by Charlotte Mew. I think it's particularly important with this poem to consider autobiographical detail and contextual information. So I'll start off by just giving a little bit of that. It's summarized just at the top here. So Mew had a particularly tragic upbringing. She was one of a family of 7 siblings. She witnessed 3 brothers die while she was still quite young and still a child. She was the eldest daughter of 7, so 7 siblings in total. Then the 3 brothers died. Later, another brother and sister were committed, which left just 2 siblings, Charlotte and Anne. And this is quite important to the poem, as you'll see later on in the video. So we really need to consider the relationship between the 2 of them throughout. Anne was also quite sickly. She required quite a lot of care. And as a consequence, Charlotte had to do a lot of looking after of her sister, and they spent a lot of time together. So they had a close but quite troubled relationship. Mew's father passed in 1898, which left quite a lot of debts behind, causing bills and financial difficulty for Mew to have to sort of cope with and deal with. Mew also very sadly eventually took her own life. So as you can probably understand and make sense of, Mew's poems typically focus on quite dark themes, quite tragic themes. Death, mental illness, loneliness, and disillusionment are just 4 of the main themes that characterize her writing. So do have a think as we go through this poem and think about how those themes come across. Interestingly, she also wrote a number of short stories that were sort of offering insight into some of the social ills and wrongs that she saw around her. So she wrote a couple of short stories on prostitution, sort of exposing the loneliness and the inability for people to escape the social constructs that they're sort of confined in. So that's also relevant to this poem, I think. And the woman who published Mew's stories was Ella Darcy, who was an editor, and she is thought to be a woman that Mew had quite an infatuation with, had romantic feelings for. And so we'll see that come into the poem as well. As with all contextual information, do ensure that you understand that this is separate to analysis in your essays. So that's an important point, because I think a lot of students tend to focus exclusively on the contextual detail, and the difficulty if you do that with such a short poem like this is that you miss out on marks that you're getting for analysing and evaluating language. So yes, this autobiographical information is important to understanding the poem, but do ensure that you are still focused very much on analysis of language and structure. Okay, so let's start to go through this poem line by line now. So interestingly, the first line, I remember rooms, we've got some alliteration used here by Mew. Now I suppose this is doing a couple of things. It's establishing the central metaphor, if you like, in the poem, or symbol. And so rooms could be considered both of these things, and it's drawing a little bit of emphasis to rooms as a sort of central subject, but also I think it's very much introducing a quite nostalgic tone, or a lamenting tone. So there are a couple of ideas that are thrown up by this symbol and metaphor of rooms. The first of those is how we take rooms to be. So are rooms this kind of sacred personal space. If you think of like, I don't know, your bedroom or somewhere for you to organize and arrange in the way that you see fit, we view rooms as sort of a sanctuary or a space in which you can unwind, almost like a haven. So that's one side of it. I think in this poem, however, there's a sort of distortion of this, and what we get instead is rooms becoming something of a prison cell for Mew, and there's definitely ideas of claustrophobia and isolation that are coming through in this poem, as you'll see. So there's a real sense of a sort of entrapment and this loss of individuality, which is so much of what a room is for someone, right? It's a place they can feel safe. I think Mew feels very differently to this, very isolated from the wider world. And then moving on to the second line, we've got some intriguing use of sibilance here. So rooms that have had their part in the steady slowing down of the heart. So we get these very sibilant S sounds coming through. So one way of taking this is that, this is exposing a threat through this, almost like this hissing sound here that's coming through. And what Mew's essentially talking about is this kind of slow, drawn out emotional death. It's the steady slowing down, and there's something quite sinister about that, about kind of knowing that this death is happening, this emotional, spiritual death. And so there's definitely a heightening of tension here in the initial couplet. But also of note, I think, is the fact that this is very much a rhyming couplet. We get the a, part, and heart. And so we get this very neat rhyme that is somehow, I think, contrasting this very sinister, dark tone. And if you read the poem aloud, I remember rooms that have had their part in the steady slowing down of the heart. It's almost too perfect, it's too neat there. And the rhyme really just contradicts this rather sinister, dark tone, almost acting as a mask for true emotion, or true emotion felt. And the fact that structurally this is end-stopped here does suggest a sort of sense of finality, death as being something final. Obviously Mew goes on to explain a little bit, but I think this is the main idea of the poem, introduced just in the first two lines, rooms having their part in the steady slowing down of the heart. Then in the next line we get the room in Paris, the room at Geneva. So although we've got this idea of anaphora coming through, this repetition of the phrase, the room, establishing like monotony and a little bit of consistency, it is worth noting that these prepositions do change. We've got the room in Paris, the room at Geneva, which marks these out as very differing experiences. Now, I mentioned before that Mew had some romantic interests, and particularly was very infatuated with Ella Darcy. So we do get a sense of Paris, obviously being the city of love, and a place where, perhaps there's this scene of romantic rejection. And in fact, if we look at the context of this, we know that Mew did actually propose to Ella Darcy. There was a proposal, which was snubbed, right? It was rejected. So if we take this back to the sort of meaning of the poem as an idea that Mew wants to break free. You know, she wants to break free, she wants to establish her individuality, but also she wants to fit in to society in the normal way. She wants to start a romance, she wants to do things normally, fall in love. It's a very human thing to do, right? But she's unable to do that. Instead, she is restricted. And so we've got restrictions and also rejection coming up here as a couple of feelings. So we're on to the next line now, and we've got some really quite sensory language coming through, polysensory language really in these two lines. And so it starts off, we've got the seaweed smell, which is obviously an olfactory imagery pertaining to the sense of smell. And really seaweed here, if you've ever noticed the sun on seaweed before, you'll know that it's really quite horrible. So there's a sense of something very repugnant. There's feelings of decay and disgust that are thrown up by Mew here. And we've got the maddening sound of the tide as well. This is an oral image, and we get this idea of the sea almost being this torturous temptress for Mew here. Although she might want to be a part of nature, she cannot be. She's trapped, she's confined to this room, and so she is unable to engage with nature being just out of reach. So what we get is this distortion of something that's normally a scene of peace and tranquility. You know, you associate the lapping of the waves with something quite calming and soothing. Here for Mew, it's having the exact opposite effect. It's frustrating her, and it's extremely unpleasant and makes her think of death and images of rotting and decay. And certainly this idea of a little damp room would suggest something uninhabitable, something that might be suitable for being condemned, but certainly not for living in. And in the next line, we get the first glimmer that death actually might be something of a relief or something of a good thing for the speaker, talking about rooms where for good or for ill things died. So setting up that contrast there, I think, is particularly interesting. So we've got the contrast between for good or for ill. So the recognition of, yes, death can be something tragic, death can be something extremely emotionally traumatic, but also there's a sense of resignation, and the fact that sometimes people need to accept death. There needs to be an acceptance. Sometimes it is for the greater good for that person, so that we get a sense of the inevitability of death through this contrast, I think. And then, but there is the room where we too lie dead. Here we start to see these autobiographical details come in again. We've got we too lie dead. Now this is thought of as being a direct reference to Anne, Mew's sister. And if you read the second line as well, though every morning we seem to wake and might just as well seem to sleep again, I think there is a sense, a powerful sense of hopelessness and despair here that comes through these two lines. And I wonder, obviously her sister Anne is extremely ailing. She's suffering from cancer. She's needing a lot of care, a lot of assistance, a lot of support. I wonder if there is just a subtle tone of resentment shot through that line. We too lie dead. And I think, the brackets of two, serve to emphasize that, to underscore that. It invites a little pause, in the same way that this caesura, this hyphen here, does as well. So a little bit of a shift. Also, you might look at this bracket as, obviously brackets imply an idea of restriction. So in the same way that brackets restrict the language in the poem here, you might consider Mew and Anne together, locked in this room, very much restricted, confined and isolated from the rest of the wider world. And this next line here is the longest in the poem by quite some way. So we've got, though every morning we seem to wake and might just as well seem to sleep again. It's extremely long, and it's worth noting that. So the length of the line here might convey a sense of exhaustion, a sense of monotony, a sense of boredom from both Anne and Mew herself. It's almost like she's going through the motions of life. And that, there's a powerful sense of monotony, and there's a continuation here as well, because the line is enjambed. So we've got seem to sleep again. Those two lines are kind of connected together and they flow in. And I wonder if there's a sort of multiple way of interpreting this sleep, waking and sleeping. I think rather than it just being a sense of falling asleep and waking up, I think we've also got to consider the sort of spiritual interpretation as well. The sense of being alive and awake to the world around you and nature around you, and an appreciation of life, and sleeping as being ignorant and deprived in some way. Alternatively, if you read this in tandem with the final two lines, so sleep again as we shall somewhere in the other quieter, dustier bed. Popular interpretation of this is that this quieter, dustier bed is referring to Mew's grave, and the sleeping here, as we just mentioned, might be to a sort of death. Okay, so as to mean death, as a metaphor for death. And that is a popular interpretation. I do think it does marry with this idea of hopelessness, and almost the existential crisis that Mew seems to be going throughout the poem. This question of, why am I here? What's my purpose? What have I done in my life? And these questions we're always asking as we near our own death. And if you were to take that interpretation, that would be fine. Out there in the sun and in the rain. So with this interpretation, we could think that, although they get a sort of glimmer of nature, it is only through death that they're allowed to experience this. So death comes as something of a relief to the speaker, and a relief to her companion, her sister Anne. So there's that interpretation. I have to say, I quite like the optimistic reading at the end of this poem, this sort of slight glimmer of optimism. I do think that quieter, dustier bed, if we compare this to like the damp room from the start of the poem, quiet suggests, an image of tranquility. Dustier bed suggests something unruffled and unused. And I think, out there in the sun, in the rain, if you contrast that with the maddening sound of the tide and, the other images of nature that are so repugnant and repulsive earlier in the poem, I quite like this idea of, hope. It's very slight, but it might be hopeful, that through death, or through sleep, you can finally access the sort of missing elements and attain liberty and freedom. Now, I know that doesn't necessarily align with some of the autobiographical information that we've talked about, but I do think that's valid. That's definitely a valid interpretation, and obviously you want to be, when you're writing about this poem, able to offer different takes and alternative viewpoints, and I do think that interpretation is equally valid. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the structure of the poem just briefly, because I think it is important, and there's definitely a lot to say about it. So I talked about this couplet at the start before, so the rest of the rhyme scheme, as you'll notice, goes B, C, D, D, E, F, G, E, G. So a few things to say here. Firstly, that we do get quite regular couplets within the poem. There's one at the start. There's obviously one in the middle here. Tied and died rhyme quite closely together. So perhaps you could marry this with interpretation around Mew almost wanting unity and solidarity, perhaps with her sister, trying to attain peace and tranquility, but not able to do so, and so the rhyme scheme then lapses into awkwardness. And certainly there are some awkward lines in the poem. This third line here, Geneva, the scene of Mew's romantic rejection, doesn't really rhyme with anything, right? That's just a kind of a line on its own. So could you link maybe the rhyme with awkwardness, or feelings of awkwardness, and a sense of striving to attain peace and comfort? I don't know, but certainly it's something worth considering there. You'll also notice that this poem takes the form of 10 lines. So we've got 10 lines in the poem, and a 10-line poem can also be referred to as a dizaine, or it takes the dizaine form. And if you look at it as it's laid out on the page, you'll notice in the anthology it does just look like a big square block, almost just a big fridge of a poem. Or does it in fact resemble a room in which the lines seem to want to break out of their shape and of their form? It seems regular, doesn't it, the structure, if you look at it at first, but you've got this line here that we mentioned before, this one ending with seam, that is a really kind of long line in comparison to the rest, and then we go to the very short line here. Is the form of the poem working to kind of break out of itself, of this large sort of big block? That's something to consider as well, because it is quite dense, isn't it, when you look at it like that? And there's a lot to say, I do think, about the structure. Okay, that is it.